What do you think you are doing? That was a priceless family heirloom.
The Waterford crystal vase shattered against the marble floor at exactly 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would later be remembered as the day the Harrington family learned who they really were. Eleanor Harrington stood frozen in her silk morning robe, watching her maid of 10 years, Rosa Martinez, pull out a checkbook from her worn apron pocket and begin writing a check for $200,000 to replace not just the vase, but the entire collection that Eleanor had spent decades accumulating. The morning sun streaming through the bay windows illuminated Rosa's weathered hands as they moved across the check with the practiced ease of someone who'd written far larger amounts, and Eleanor's scream died in her throat as she saw the balance printed on the check stub, $47 million. Mrs. Harrington, Rosa said in perfect, unaccented English, not the broken phrases she'd used for a decade, this vase was worth $8,000. I'm writing you a check for $200,000 because I want you to understand something. Money has never been the issue. For 10 years, I've scrubbed your toilets while you called me incompetent. I've accepted pennies while listening to you brag about your wealth to friends. I've slept in that windowless room you call Maid's quarters while owning 3 estates larger than this one. And I did it all for one reason, to see if wealth would blind you to basic human kindness. You failed. The check floated to the floor beside the crystal shards as Rosa straightened from the submissive posture she'd maintained for a decade. Behind Eleanor, her husband Charles emerged from his study, followed by their adult children, David and Catherine, all drawn by the sound of breaking crystal and their mother's strangled gasp. They stood in the doorway of their Hamptons mansion's living room, watching their world tilt off its axis as the woman they treated as less than human revealed herself to be wealthier than all of them combined. If you're watching this unfold on Acts of Depth, you know we believe that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in how we treat those we believe have less than us. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what led Rosa to this moment, and what happens next, will challenge everything you think you know about power, dignity, and the price of cruelty disguised as privilege. Rosa's journey to the Harrington household had begun not in poverty but in purpose. Born Rosa Martinez in Guatemala, she'd immigrated to America at 15 with her parents who built a small restaurant into a chain worth millions. By 30, she'd turned her inheritance into a fortune through tech investments, real estate, and a keen understanding of human nature that served her well in business. But success had come with a terrible cost. The more money she accumulated, the more she witnessed how wealth corrupted kindness, how privilege poisoned empathy, how those with everything treated those with nothing. The experiment had started after her father's death, when she'd stood at his funeral listening to wealthy business associates speak about him with respect while she knew they'd mocked his accent in private, had called him new money with sneers, had treated him as lesser despite his success. She'd decided then to test humanity in its rawest form, to see how people acted when they believed they held absolute power over someone powerless. The Harringtons had been her 10th family in 20 years of experiments across the country. She'd chosen them specifically because they represented everything she was studying: old money mixed with new arrogance, inherited privilege combined with earned wealth, social consciousness in public and casual cruelty in private. Charles Harrington ran a hedge fund that managed billions while paying his domestic staff minimum wage. Eleanor sat on charity boards for human rights while denying her maid basic dignity. Their children, raised in abundance, had learned to see service workers as furniture that moved. For 10 years, Rosa had endured their treatment with scientific precision, documenting every insult, every act of kindness or cruelty, every moment that revealed character. She'd kept detailed journals in the room they'd given her, a converted pantry with no windows, a thin mattress on the floor, barely large enough to lie down in. They'd never questioned why someone would accept such conditions for $12 an hour when other families paid triple. Their assumption that desperation drove her had blinded them to any other possibility. She remembered the first day she'd arrived, how Eleanor had looked her up and down with the calculating gaze of someone purchasing livestock. "Can you speak English?" had been the first question, despite Rosa's carefully crafted resume written in perfect English. "You'll need to learn our ways," Eleanor had said, as if the Harringtons possessed some special culture beyond basic human decency. "We expect perfection, discretion, and gratitude for this opportunity. The silence in the living room stretched like a taut wire as the Harrington family processed what they were witnessing. David, the 30-year-old son who worked at his father's hedge fund, was the first to speak, his voice cracking with the indignation of someone whose worldview was crumbling. "This is impossible. You're lying. Our maid can't have $47 million. You can barely speak proper English." Rosa turned to him with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "David, I speak 5 languages fluently. I have an MBA from Wharton that I earned 15 years before you bought your way into the same program. I've listened to you practice your presentations in this room, watched you struggle with basic financial concepts your father's position shields you from understanding. 3 years ago, when you were about to invest your trust fund in that cryptocurrency scam, I deliberately broke a lamp to interrupt your phone call. That clumsy mistake you mocked me for saved you $3 million. Catherine, 28 and fresh from her 3rd failed business venture funded by family money, stepped forward with her phone already recording. "This is insane. If you're so rich, why would you clean our toilets? Why would you accept the way we—" She stopped, perhaps realizing that finishing that sentence would mean acknowledging how they treated Rosa. "The way you treated me." Rosa completed the thought. "Let me remind you, Catherine. The scraps from your plates when you declared yourself too full after 2 bites, knowing I hadn't eaten all day. The designer clothes you threw at me, stained and torn, saying I should be grateful for your generosity. The time you had friends over and made me serve drinks on my supposed day off, then laughed when I stumbled from exhaustion, calling me Rosa the Robot because I never complained." Eleanor had sunk into one of the cream-colored chairs, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. 10 years, she whispered. "You've been studying us for 10 years?" "Studying is too clinical a term," Rosa replied, walking to the window where morning light created a halo effect around her graying hair that had aged prematurely from the stress of maintaining her facade. "I've been documenting whether wealth necessarily destroys empathy, whether privilege inevitably leads to cruelty, whether there was any hope that a family with everything might still treat someone with nothing as human. Charles, who'd built his fortune on reading people and situations, was already calculating damage control. What do you want? Money? You clearly don't need it. Revenge? You could have destroyed us years ago with recordings, lawsuits. Why reveal yourself now?" Rosa pulled out a thick notebook from her apron, one of dozens she'd filled over the years. "Today marks exactly 10 years since I started working for you. 10 years since Eleanor told me I should be thankful to be in America despite being a citizen longer than she'd been alive. 10 years since Charles explained that people like you needed people like us to provide opportunities. 10 years since David and Catherine saw me as a servant rather than a person." She opened the notebook to a page bookmarked with a faded photograph. It showed a young girl, perhaps 7 years old, standing beside Rosa in what looked like a hospital room. "This is Maria, my niece. 4 years ago, she needed a kidney transplant. I was a match. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday, but that was the day of Eleanor's garden party. When I asked for the day off, the first time in 6 years, you told me that help that isn't available isn't help worth keeping. You threatened to fire me and ensure I'd never work in the Hamptons again." The family exchanged glances, remembering the incident differently, as a minor inconvenience when the maid had tried to skip work for some personal drama. "I attended your party," Rosa continued. "I served your guests while my niece waited in a hospital bed. The surgery was postponed. Complications arose. Maria survived, but barely. That night, as I cleaned up after your guests who'd complimented you on finding such dedicated help, I made a decision. I would complete the full 10 years, document everything, and then reveal the truth not for revenge, but for redemption, yours, if you were capable of it." David's phone buzzed with a news alert, his face draining of color as he read. "There's an article in the Times. The Millionaire Maid, a decade-long social experiment in human cruelty. It went live 5 minutes ago." He looked up at Rosa with dawning horror. You've documented everything? Rosa nodded calmly as the Harringtons' phones began buzzing in unison, the story spreading across social media like wildfire. Every moment of significance, yes. But not for public humiliation. That article only contains anonymized examples. Your names aren't mentioned, your identities are protected. I'm not interested in destroying you. I'm interested in something far more challenging, your transformation. Eleanor stood abruptly, her silk robe swishing as she paced to the window overlooking their manicured gardens Rosa had helped maintain without pay when the landscapers were sick, though the Harringtons had taken credit for the award-winning roses. You're saying you're giving us a chance? After everything? Let me tell you about the other families, Rosa said, settling into a chair without asking permission, the first time in 10 years she'd sat in their presence without being offered a seat. The Waldmans in Seattle, they discovered my truth after 3 years when their youngest son, 9 years old, saw me reading a financial journal in Portuguese and asked why I was pretending not to understand things. That child's innocence opened their eyes. They now run a foundation providing living wages and education for domestic workers. She turned a page in her notebook. The Chens in San Francisco never found out. After 5 years, I left because their 13-year-old daughter started treating me exactly like her parents did. The cruelty had been passed down perfectly, like a genetic disease. There was no hope there. Catherine had started crying, mascara running in dark streams down her cheeks. We're like the Chens, aren't we? You stayed longer to be sure, but we're just as hopeless. That remains to be seen, Rosa replied. You see, the Harringtons are unique in one way. Despite your treatment of me, I've observed moments, fleeting, quickly suppressed, of what might be conscience. Charles, you increased my pay by 50 cents an hour after your mother died, though you never told anyone. It wasn't much, but you did it after she said on her deathbed that she regretted not being kinder to the help. Eleanor, you cried in the kitchen at 2 a.m. 3 months ago, and when you saw me, you almost, spoke to me as a person before catching yourself. David, you defended me once to your friend who called me the illegal, though you laughed along when he persisted. Catherine, you left me a birthday card 2 years ago, though you threw it away before giving it to me. I retrieved it from the trash. The family stood frozen as Rosa revealed she'd seen their humanity even as they'd hidden it from themselves and each other. Charles cleared his throat, his businessman's composure cracking. You saw all that? We didn't even. I didn't realize. That's precisely the problem, Rosa said. Your glimpses of empathy were treated as weaknesses to overcome rather than strengths to nurture. You've been performing cruelty for each other, each afraid to be the first to show kindness, each trapped in a system you created but no longer control. David slumped against the doorframe. So what happens now? You expose us completely. Take some kind of revenge. Rosa stood, walking to the crystal shards still scattered on the marble floor. She knelt, not in servitude but in purpose, and began picking up the pieces with her bare hands. Now, you choose. I'm leaving today. My lawyers will deliver documents showing that I've established a foundation for domestic workers' rights with $30 million. You can either fight the story, deny everything, and retreat further into your privilege, or you can join me in changing how this country treats its most vulnerable workers. Eleanor moved forward instinctively to stop Rosa from handling the sharp crystal, then froze, realizing the irony of caring about Rosa's hands now after watching them bleed from harsh chemicals for 10 years. You want us to help you? After we've proven ourselves to be monsters? You've proven yourselves to be human, Rosa corrected, standing with her hands full of crystal shards that caught the light like diamonds. Humans shaped by systems that reward cruelty and punish kindness. The question is whether you're capable of reshaping yourselves. Catherine pulled out her phone, not to record but to delete the video she'd started. I don't even know how to begin. We don't even know your real last name. We've called you Rosa Martinez for 10 years, but that's not real, is it? For the first time, Rosa smiled, not the servile smile she'd perfected but a genuine expression that transformed her face. My name is Dr. Rosa Elena Vega-Martinez. I have a PhD in behavioral economics from MIT. My dissertation was on wealth inequality and empathy deterioration in inherited versus earned affluence. You've been my most comprehensive case study. The revelation of Rosa's full identity sent another shockwave through the room. Charles, whose success had been built on recognizing talent and intelligence, felt the crushing weight of his decade-long blindness. Dr. Vega-Martinez. I've read your work. Your paper on economic blindness and social perception is required reading at Harvard Business School. I've quoted you in board meetings. His voice broke. I've quoted you while you were cleaning my bathroom. Rosa set the crystal shards carefully on the side table, her movements deliberate and dignified. Yes, you have. 3 times, actually. Once particularly memorably when you explained to dinner guests how some economist named Vega had proven that wealthy individuals literally lose the ability to read facial expressions of those they perceive as lower class. You demonstrated my thesis perfectly while I served your wine. The morning sun had climbed higher, flooding the room with light that seemed to expose more than just the family's physical space. Every corner that Rosa had cleaned, every surface she'd polished, suddenly seemed to bear witness to the decade of willful blindness that had played out in this house. David pulled up something on his phone, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief and shame. You own Vega Tech Industries. The company that rejected our firm's management proposal last year. You sent us a rejection letter explaining our fundamental misunderstanding of human capital value. That was you. That was me, Rosa confirmed. Your proposal suggested cutting custodial staff by 40% and installing monitoring software to ensure maximum productivity from the remaining workers. You never considered that those custodians might be supporting families, might have dignity, might be human beings deserving of respect rather than surveillance. Eleanor had moved to the mantel where family photos stood in silver frames, generations of Harringtons posed in formal perfection, served by anonymous staff members whose faces were never captured, whose names were never recorded. 10 years. You could have bought this house. You could have bought 10 of these houses. Why did you stay? Rosa walked to the photos, picking up one from the previous Christmas. In the background, barely visible, she could be seen carrying a tray of food, her face turned away from the camera. Because I needed to understand something my father never could. He died believing that if he just accumulated enough wealth, people like you would finally see him as equal. He never understood that the problem wasn't his bank account, it was the inability of privilege to recognize humanity across economic lines. She turned to face them fully. But here's what I discovered that my father never knew, it's not inability, it's choice. Every day for 10 years, you chose not to see me. You chose to believe that someone who cleaned your house couldn't possibly have thoughts, dreams, intelligence, worth beyond their service to you. That choice was comfortable. It was easy. It protected you from examining your own privilege. Catherine stepped forward, her voice small but determined. The birthday card I threw away, I wrote that you reminded me of my grandmother. She was kind and patient and never complained. I threw it away because Mom said it was inappropriate to form attachments to staff. I was 22. Old enough to know better, but I chose the easy path. We all did, Charles admitted, loosening his tie as if it were choking him. Every raise I didn't give you, every holiday you worked without bonus, every time I walked past you without acknowledgement, those were choices. I told myself it was maintaining professional boundaries, but it was really maintaining comfortable cruelty. Rosa pulled out another item from her apron, a small recorder. The family tensed, but she set it on the table without turning it on. This has been recording for 10 years. Every conversation, every insult, every moment of casual dehumanization. I could destroy your business, your social standing, everything you've built. One upload to social media and you'd be finished. Do it, David said suddenly, surprising everyone including himself. We deserve it. We've been horrible. We've been exactly the kind of people everyone hates about the 1%. Rosa shook her head. Destruction is easy. Transformation is hard. I don't want to destroy you, I want to challenge you to become who you could have been all along. She pulled out a folder from beneath her notebook. This is a contract establishing the Harrington Family Foundation for Domestic Worker Dignity. It requires you to contribute 50% of your annual income for the next 10 years, the same 10 years you've benefited from my labor. The foundation will provide living wages, healthcare, education, and legal support for domestic workers. Eleanor took the contract with trembling hands, her perfectly manicured nails a stark contrast to Rosa's weathered fingers. As she read through the terms, tears began falling onto the pages, smudging the ink. 50% of our income. That would change everything about how we live. Yes, Rosa said simply. It would change everything. That's the point. You can't transform while maintaining the same comfort that enabled your cruelty. Change requires sacrifice. For 10 years, I sacrificed my comfort, my dignity, my identity to understand you. Now I'm asking you to sacrifice your excess to understand yourselves. Charles had been doing calculations on his phone, his businessman's mind automatically assessing the impact. This would mean selling the house in Martha's Vineyard, pulling the kids from private clubs, flying commercial instead of private. We'd have to live like. He paused, the irony hitting him, like normal people. Like the 99% of humanity you've spent your lives avoiding, Rosa clarified. Like the teachers, nurses, firefighters, and yes, domestic workers who keep society functioning while you accumulate wealth from wealth. Catherine picked up the pen from the table, her hand hovering over the signature line. What if we sign this and fail? What if we can't change, can't break the patterns we've inherited and reinforced? Rosa's expression softened for the first time, showing the compassion that had allowed her to endure a decade of dehumanization without losing her own humanity. Then you'll have tried. And in trying, you'll have honored the 10 years I invested in believing you could be better. My father used to say, La verdadera riqueza está en lo que damos, no en lo que guardamos, true wealth is in what we give, not what we keep. David moved to stand beside his sister, looking at the contract that would fundamentally alter their lives. You know what the ironic thing is? We always talked about making a difference, about using our privilege for good. We went to charity galas, wrote checks, sat on boards. But we never actually sacrificed anything. It was all performance, wasn't it? Performance without sacrifice is just theater, Rosa agreed. Real change requires real cost. For 10 years, you've performed kindness while practicing cruelty. Now I'm asking you to practice kindness even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. Eleanor signed first, her signature shaky but determined. My mother was a maid before she married my father. She never told anyone, was ashamed of it her whole life. She taught me to distance myself from service workers because she was terrified of being recognized as one of them. I've dishonored her memory by perpetuating the very shame she carried. Charles signed next, his usual confident signature reduced to something smaller, humbler. My first job was washing dishes. I swore I'd never be invisible again. Instead, I became someone who made others invisible. That ends today. Catherine and David signed together, their hands touching as they committed to a future radically different from their past. As the ink dried on the papers, the morning sun reached its apex, flooding the room with light that seemed to bless the transformation taking place. Rosa carefully folded the contract and placed it in her apron one last time. Then, with deliberate ceremony, she removed the apron she'd worn for a decade and laid it on the table. Underneath, she wore a simple but elegant dress, the kind of outfit that suggested quiet wealth and confidence. There's one more thing, she said, pulling out a final item from the apron pocket, a check made out to the Harrington Family Trust. This is for $1 million. It's the exact amount you would have paid me over 10 years if you'd offered a living wage, benefits, and treated me as a professional household manager rather than invisible labor. Charles stared at the check. "You're giving us money? After everything?" "I'm investing in your transformation," Rosa corrected. "This money comes with conditions. It must be used to pay living wages to domestic workers you hire. You must provide benefits, dignity, and respect. You must see them, truly see them, as humans deserving of the same consideration you'd give anyone else. Consider it seed money for your new life." As Rosa prepared to leave, Catherine suddenly rushed forward and did something she'd never done in 10 years, she hugged Rosa. Not the air kisses of social performance but a real embrace, one human to another. "Will we see you again? Will you check on us, make sure we're keeping our promise?" Rosa returned the embrace, feeling the weight of 10 years lifting from her shoulders. "You'll see me, but you won't recognize me. I might be the woman serving you at a restaurant, the person cleaning your office, the stranger you pass on the street. The test isn't whether you're kind when you know it's me, it's whether you're kind when you think no one important is watching." As she walked toward the door, David called out, "Dr. Vega-Martinez, what would have happened if we'd been kind from the beginning? If we'd treated you with dignity from day one?" Rosa turned back one final time, sunlight creating a corona around her as she stood in the doorway. "Then you would have had a brilliant friend, advisor, an ally for 10 years instead of an invisible servant. The tragedy isn't what I lost, I chose this path. The tragedy is what you lost by choosing not to see me. 10 years of conversations we could have had, insights we could have shared, humanity we could have celebrated together. That's the true cost of cruelty, not what it takes from others, but what it steals from ourselves." She walked out into the bright morning, leaving the Harrington family standing in their perfect living room, surrounded by the shattered pieces of crystal that suddenly seemed like a metaphor for their broken worldview. As her footsteps faded, Eleanor picked up the apron Rosa had left behind, holding it like a sacred relic. 10 years, she whispered. "We had genius, kindness, and wisdom cleaning our house for 10 years, and we chose not to see it." Charles put his arm around his wife, pulling his children close. "The question now is what we do with the next 10 years. Do we honor her sacrifice or waste her investment?" Through the window, they watched Rosa get into a car they'd never seen before, a modest but well-maintained Tesla that had been parked just out of sight for a decade. As she drove away, the family stood together, perhaps for the first time truly together, united not in privilege but in the humbling recognition of how much humanity they'd missed by choosing comfort over compassion. The crystal shards remained on the floor, catching the light and throwing rainbows across the walls, broken beauty that somehow seemed more honest than the false perfection it had once represented. The Harringtons had a choice: sweep up the pieces and continue as before, or leave them as a reminder that sometimes things need to shatter completely before they can be rebuilt into something better. Catherine picked up Rosa's notebook, left behind intentionally. The first page contained a single quote: "The measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members. The measure of a person is how they treat those from whom they have nothing to gain." 10 years of testing humanity had ended, but for the Harrington family, the real test had just begun. They had wealth, but Rosa had given them something far more valuable: the chance to discover if they could transform privilege into purpose, if they could choose to see the humanity they'd spent a decade ignoring, if they could become the people Rosa had spent 10 years hoping they might be. The morning sun climbed higher, blessing a house that would never be the same, a family that would either rise to meet Rosa's challenge or fall back into the comfortable cruelty of inherited indifference. Only time would tell if the millionaire maid's 10-year investment in their humanity would yield the returns she'd hoped for, not in money but in the only currency that truly mattered: the recognition that every person who serves us is a universe of possibility we can choose to see or ignore, and that choice defines not their worth but our own.